All right. Hello, everyone. My name is John Degen. I'm the chair of the International Authors Forum Steering Committee and Chief Executive Officer of the Writers Union of Canada. I'm pleased to welcome you to this discussion about the authorship and artificial intelligence. Well, I'm not sure pleased is the right word. I'm deeply concerned. I'm scared of what the future may hold. I'm exhausted by the seemingly endless lineup of threats to professional creation coming out of the tech sector, all those things. But yes, I am also pleased that we have assembled an expert panel to discuss the impact of artificial intelligence on authorship. Let me quickly remind you that this talk is being recorded and streamed live on Facebook, I believe. If you intend to tweet about this event, and you're certainly welcome and encouraged to do so, please use the hashtag creating a living. I want to start by acknowledging that my home in Canada is in Takaranto, which is a Mohawk word that translates to where the trees meet the water, or the gathering place. I pay my respects to Canada's first storytellers and artists, and I am extremely grateful to have a home here. So yes, it would be difficult to pay attention to the world of professional creation today without having run into 5 or 6 long, terrifying think pieces in the media about artificial intelligence and its predicted dramatic, possibly existential impact on artists of all kinds, whether you're a visual artist, an actor, a musician, or a writer. You've been told more than once recently that the robots are coming for your job, that they've likely already infringed your copyright, and that there's little to nothing that you can do about it. Just in the last few days, for me, I've heard a news report on US National Public Radio about how AI concerns are central to the Writers Guild of America strike in the film and television industry. I've seen data coming out of Australia showing that 74% of surveyed artists expressed significant concern about the threat of generative AI tools to writing or publishing professions. And I've seen several news reports about how governments and lawmakers feel they're already far behind, perhaps too far behind, in trying to regulate this technology. So swamped recently with media coverage of generative AI, I thought I would take a firsthand look. And so I asked ChatGPT to write a sponsorship proposal for the Writers Union of Canada. This is the organization that I work for. And within 30 seconds of my asking, a very vague ask, in fact, the now widely used tool returned to me a page-long, reasonable first draft of something that I might have written myself before my first coffee of the day. So clearly, ChatGPT had quickly scraped the union's website for information and worked from previously trained knowledge of sponsor approach vocabulary. But would I send out what it produced to potential sponsors? Of course not. It was far too vague and general. It had zero personality and no human touch. I believe that I am still a better writer than the robots. But could I use AI as a tool in my writing to create that first draft that I then perfect? Should I? Don't I already? I mean, what drives my email programs to suggest words or entire sentences to me when I'm writing a response? How does Microsoft Word, for instance, know when I've made a spelling or grammar mistake and quickly fix it before I even finish typing, which is something that still sort of freaks me out. One thing I hope we get into in today's discussion is a better understanding of the borderlines that currently separate human work from AI, and why, as I honestly believe, we should put work into building a premium economy around human-generated creativity. We have a wonderful panel with us today, all of whom are deeply engaged in the intersection of artificial intelligence and the creative professions. So I will get to introductions now. I'll tell you a little bit about everyone, but then I'll throw to each one of our panel to go into a bit more detail about their own thinking on this fascinating, somewhat scary topic. If you in the audience have questions as we go along, please use the Q&A function, not the chat function, the Q&A function, one of the buttons at the bottom of your screen, and I will read them out as humanly as possible. So as I go along on my screen, Dr. Tom Chatfield is an author and tech philosopher with a special interest in critical thinking and the ethics of technology. He's a non-executive director at the Authors Licensing and Collecting Society and the Copyright Licensing Agency in the UK. An advisory council member to the British Library, which is one of my favorite places in the world, and a guest lecturer at institutions across the UK and USA. His books exploring digital culture are translated into over 30 languages. He also writes fiction, children's books, textbooks, and for video games. So welcome, Tom. Paolo Lanteri is a lawyer specializing in intellectual property law and a member of both the Spanish and Italian bar associations. He works in the copyright law division of the World Intellectual Property Organization. Paolo manages a number of projects in areas at the intersection between copyright law and new technologies, such as user-generated content, software and video games protection, new business models, access to knowledge initiatives, and emerging licensing schemes. Mary Rasenberger is Chief Executive Officer of the Authors Guild and Authors Guild Foundation in the United States. Prior to joining the Guild in 2014, Mary practiced law for over 25 years in roles that span private practice, the government, and corporate sector as a recognized expert in copyright and media law. From 2002 to 2008, Mary worked for the US Copyright Office and Library of Congress as Senior Policy Advisor and Program Director for the National Digital Preservation Program. Mary, let's start with you. Last fall, you wrote a long piece on generative AI for the Authors Guild member bulletin, and I believe that's public on the website, so I encourage everyone to go and look at it. And that summarizes and outlines the issues raised by this technology. For me, reading that piece, the take-home point was this sentence: computer art will always stand still without new human art to train on. Can you expand on that idea and tell us what you focus on as the AI threat and or opportunity for professional human creation? Oh, you're muted.
Yeah. Yes, thank you, John. Sorry about that. It's good to be here today. So first, let me clarify that sentence. The use of the term computer art was within the context of an article about generative AI. So wasn't talking about computer art generally, which can be interpreted to mean anything, any art made with a computer. But what I was saying is that AI generated content, there's nothing truly new or creative in anything that generative AI technologies as we know them today generates. The outputs are always derivative of what they've been trained on. And in other words, they're complex, very complex mashups in some cases without adding anything new. So the way these generative AI systems like GPT, which is the foundational model for GPT chat, GPT-4, and there are a lot of apps built on top of that, or Google's large language models or LLMs. They are created by being trained on millions of pre-existing works. So GPT was trained on millions of books, articles, websites, and then they used statistical algorithms to recognize patterns and relationships in the data and make successful predictions when queried. That's what these LLMs do. They do not think. They have no independent knowledge other than what they have been trained on, or some people say read. They have no other relationship to the world, no creative spark. They simply spit out recombinations of what they've been trained on. So in that sense, they generate nothing new. Where the human arts are about moving, they evolve because humans strive to reflect the world they live in. Whether if it's about the past, it's the way humans in the present think about the past, or the future, it's taking today's experience and reflecting on the future. And human art reflects emotions, feeling, thought, intellect. Humans cannot create without adding some of their own personality. And they do learn from reading and are inspired by prior works. But what makes it art is that humans bring their experience, their emotion, their communication, their knowledge of the world to bear on what they express. And I just want a quote from Leonardo da Vinci. He says, "Where the spirit does not work with the hand, there is no art." In other words, the personality is part of the art. AI, generative AI, by its very nature, cannot add any of that experience, any of that perception, or any thinking. And I know some people, think or talk about generative AI being sentient, but it's not. Even though it's been trained to talk like a human being and feel sentient. So that is why it is so crucial to ensure that AI generated content does not take over the human arts, because generative AI content will always be stuck in the past. And in that sense, if we don't have human arts, the arts will stand still. The folks in the tech industry love to say, well, okay, so it's disruption, it's technological disruption. Yeah, people will lose jobs. A lot of people are going to lose jobs because of generative AI. But with creativity, it's not just a matter of potential job loss. It's the potential for losing our culture. Our arts are at stake. And in the US, we'd like to remind our Congress of how important the arts are to not just culture, society. It's the fabric that holds us together, but it's also a huge part of our economy. It's almost 8% of our economy in the United States. So we have to protect it. We at the Authors Guild are strongly opposed to giving AI-generated content any copyright protection. And I think we'll get to this later. There's a great deal, you alluded to this, John, of creative works being generated by AI with human assistance, or humans using AI as a tool to create new works. And that's not what we're talking about here. When humans use AI as a tool, that should be copyrightable to the extent that the final work includes any AI-generated content, that those elements are not protectable, but the work as a whole is. But when a work is largely AI-generated, that should not be protected by copyright. And we implore other countries to take the same hard line. We do not want there to be financial incentives for publishers and others to use AI, because in a market economy, there is naturally going to be a race to the bottom. Companies, even creators, are going to feel they need to use AI to save costs and stay competitive. And we all need to prevent that from happening, because otherwise the markets are quickly going to become inundated with these derivative, low quality AI-generated materials, and it will drown out the human-produced works. And then there won't be enough money in the system to keep these creative professions alive. It will be left with hobbyists at that point, and AI-generated content. And to me, that is a really depressing thought. So we view this as existential, and I know a lot of other creator organizations in the U.S. feel the same. We have a coalition of other groups we're working with. It's right in front of us, and we've got to put up the guardrails to prevent human creativity from being overtaken by AI, because we will lose our culture.
Thanks, Mary. And we kind of saw this coming a long way off. When I think back to a lot of the work that your organization and my organization have done together, going all the way back to like the Google Books case and settlement there, the main concern at the time was immediate market stuff. But a sort of a side concern, and maybe it should have been the central concern, was what are they doing with all of these works that they're scanning? They're using them for machine learning. They're using them to train potential AI for the future. And what does that mean for our copyright? So I think we've been on this file for a long time, and it's just really hit the public consciousness just recently.
Right.
Let's
Yeah,
move to.
I agree with you. As you know, we've been talking about this for a number of years. But with the release of these consumer-facing applications,
Exactly. Yeah.
now it's really in the forefront, and people understand what's at stake.
Yeah, Google Books was over a decade ago, so we've been on it for that long. Okay, let's move to Tom. Tom, you have the word chat in your last name. That had me briefly worried that I was talking to a robot created by Microsoft, but I'm glad to see that you appear to be human. Are Mary and I right to be worried? What's your take on AI from a tech philosophy perspective?
Thanks very much, John, and thank you, Mary. I want to start by both nodding to what's been said and invoking this fascinating word, hallucination, which is used a lot in conjunction with generative AIs, and it describes in very anthropomorphic terms the capacity or tendency of AIs to generate extremely plausible and convincing but non-reality based responses to queries. So for example, if I ask ChatGPT about myself, and I would recommend anyone with a modicum of a public profile to do this, because of course that is one area where you really are the expert. You probably know more than even Google about yourself. If I ask it about me, it tells me a whole bunch of correct things. And then it says I host a podcast called The Chatfield Show. As far as I know, I don't do this, but it's rather curious being told that I do by an AI. It makes me wonder whether I should, whether in a sort of algorithmically optimized world, I would host that, or if I started hosting it, the AI would love me more. The point is that AI's generative systems are in a very, very indirect relationship with reality. They generate statistically plausible responses on the basis of prompts and training data. And they can do this endlessly and with endless confidence. But the connections between this data act and reality are often tenuous and unreliable. And with my philosophical hat on, that puts people in a perhaps unexpected position. We've always tended in literature and philosophy to portray machines as logical and truthful. You know, machines can't lie. This is the sort of basis of a whole genre of science fiction. But it turns out that the machines we've got lie all the time, endlessly. They don't even know what truth is. They don't even exist in the world. It's up to us to anchor their outputs to reality. And exactly as Mary said, we live in a world in which very rapidly we're facing the hazard of absolute tidal waves, not so much of disinformation or misinformation as just kind of vaguely, impressionistically, kind of true, kind of false, kind of prejudicial, kind of nothing, just stuff. The philosopher Daniel Dennett recently made an impassioned plea in the Atlantic magazine for the regulation of simulated humans, or rather what he meant was, it is now possible online for AIs to simulate digital people, to simulate the presence of human beings in digital spaces to a degree that is, you know, more or less indistinguishable from real ones. And to paraphrase him, he said these are some of the most dangerous artifacts ever to be created in history. Because when it comes to democratic processes, when it comes to how we live and share and so on, potentially the existence of this sort of pseudo or kinder information undermines an enormous amount of what we think and do and are. Now, why does this matter in the concept of authorship? Well, for me, the point that authors, among others, are very acutely aware of, and that I think Mary was very eloquently making, is that nevertheless, all of this still begins and ends with people. All of the data that matters, all of the writing, all of the experiences, the very fact that language can be used by machines begins with the products or observation of humans. And it ends with us too, because all of the stuff only matters ultimately if people like it or believe it or buy it or endorse it. We are the beginning and the end. We are the reality. And this means that for all the wonderfulness of endless hallucinatory generation of pseudo facts and pseudo people and impressionistic extrapolations. Ultimately, it's the trustworthiness and the transparency of these systems and the ways they interact with us that matter. So I want to just use a few words beginning with T to make what I think are some of the crucial underlying points of debate. And I would emphasize that I think, copyright is an extraordinarily important way of talking about these things, but that I think it's quite important not to get, as it were, sidetracked into conversations about how good AI is or isn't at producing stuff, whether people are or are not distinguishable from it for a given value of output. That way lies madness. It's very good at fooling us and doing us impressions of us because it's eaten everything we've ever done. I think we need to focus on truth, on the idea of what it means to anchor ideas to the world, to make true claims, but also for stories to be about particular people and life as it's lived, and life as it's experienced to be the products of a life and spoken to a life. I think we need to be very interested in transparency, which is the very basic question of what has gone into the training set. If you want me to use your system, what did you train it on? I need to know that if I'm going to trust you. And trustworthiness, which, as the philosopher Honora Anil and others have observed in a digital age, needs to be earned. It's not just the mystical property of a very clever system. Trustworthiness is something that is earned because of participation in a certain set of norms and obligations. And the last T I want to raise is the idea of talent, of human talent, which for me is one of the great whys. Why do we have copyright law? Why do we care that people write stuff or enjoy stuff or care about stuff or get to think or write or do? Because on some level, we believe there are both instrumental and non-instrumental or intrinsic values to the human pursuit of beauty and art and truth, to the telling of stories, to the creation of original creative objects. Where technology respects and enhances these things, it is a tremendous gift. Where it makes them more accessible to more different people in new ways, it is wonderful. And where it allows us to discover and celebrate and remake and remix old works in a manner that respects the human and the truthful and so on, great, marvelous. But where instead it threatens to drown us in tidal ways of undifferentiated pseudo-human materials that we cannot trust and that just endlessly pollute our information environments with nonsense that further AIs will be trained on, we're in a very bad position. So the question I want to leave you with is, what do we want from artificial intelligence? What do we want it to do and why? What purposes should it serve? There is nothing intrinsically good about any of this. And I am deeply interested in what it means to ask these questions rigorously of people who often would rather shirk them and obfuscate with lots of magical hand waving.
I like how your question, what do we want from AI, assumes that we are still in control to be able to ask that question. That's an optimism about the technology I really appreciate.
Well, of course, I mean, the we is an unequal we, but I mean, I know what AI wants. It lives in the basements of big corporations and it wants them to make money. I think, of course, the we is a very unequal we, but for me at least, I think it's an enormous mistake, tempting as it is, to succumb to an inevitabilism and to portray technology as having some kind of internal logic that dictates the future. I think quite the reverse is true. Technology exists in the world, embodied in certain ways, run by certain companies, embedded in certain systems of regulation, and so on and so on. It's very hard to control. It's very unpredictable. It's very difficult. But by goodness, people are the ones who are pulling all the levers.
Yep. And we do manage to get people off the planet and into outer space. That's difficult too. So I'm sure we can be good at this as well. So let's move to Paolo. Paolo, you're kind of uniquely positioned at WIPO to see the rise of this new technology in your own context, which is the context of global legal considerations, the various treaties and agreements that regulate global trade and creativity. Where does AI creation and training fit into established international agreements on intellectual property and copyright? But I guess I should really ask, does it fit? And if not, how do we make it fit?
Thanks, John, and good afternoon, everyone. The short answer to your question would be it depends really to whom you ask and from which perspective you look at those issues. The debate surrounding copyright and artificial intelligence started several years ago, basically when AI techniques were beginning to be used to do all the things that we just described that were typically domain of human artistry and creativity. So they now operate in all areas of the creative industries. For instance, just at the international level at WIPO, this conversation started in 2018, 2019. The questions were very similar, not identical, but the approach, the sense of urgency nowadays is different. Back then, we had hundreds of stakeholders and member states saying that that was a very important issue we should focus on, but there was no call for immediate action, probably because the speed of the technological development was so fast that took us really partially unprepared. Now we feel a sense of urgency, both from rights holders' perspective, we already heard it, and it's enough to basically read the news, watch the news to see it, in strikes and so on. But also on the end of the policymakers, there is a sense of urgency. You see everywhere, for instance, the European Commission started drafting an AI Act. It was just, I discovered this morning on IPCAT news post that the UK Parliament held an oral evidence session specifically analyzing the impact of generative AI on the creative industries related to copyright law. So very specific. China announced in April a draft regulation for generative artificial intelligence services and open up a public consultation nowadays. And if we move to international organizations, we have WIPO, we have UNESCO working on the ethics of AI instrument that is already there. ITU working on AI for goods. It's really global, cross-cutting, all areas that are even only partially related to creative industries. So in terms of IP, public policy, the fundamental question is how do we make sure the copyright system continues to serve the fundamental purpose of incentivizing creativity and therefore availability of cultural, entertainment, and educational content. Obviously, the international framework was addressing human creativity and was never meant to regulate these new scenarios. That's clear also for chronological reasons. We can spend a lot of time about that, but it has rules and principles that are providing answers, some answers, and guidance to the many national legislations that are now currently being tested in court. Don't want to list the court cases ongoing, but those are already a reflection of what was enshrined at international level. So there are many other important factors for the creative industries, but for copyright specifically, they were already described very well by Mary. There are two elements. One relates to the input, the things that are that are used to train the machine. I mean, similarly to painters, composers, journalists, those AI needs to ingest, it needs to learn from existing work. In the creative field, some of that work can be in the public domain, but generally speaking, some of those are protected, and the machine would normally undertake some acts that are covered by copyright, like reproduction, adaptation, many things. So unless a work is in the public domain, unless you have a license, or unless there is a specific exception covering that machine learning and data, works ingestion would be an infringement. That's in principle the standard approach. So now we go, okay, public domain, we all understand what it is. Licensing, we also very well understand what it is. How do we stand on licensing? This is a question for you. But then there is a question, where can we consider that those actions are covered by the flexibility, are considered fair use, are accepted by copyright protection? So far, we have a relatively small number of national or countries that went deep and decided what it's permissible or not. We have, of course, the European directive and the text and data mining exceptions that allows TDM for research, allows it also for commercial purposes, but also provides for an opt-out provision for authors. Then we have the fair use approach. I leave it to the experts in the audience to decide whether some of the machine learning would be covered or not. Then we have the very broad Japan exception, the no enjoyment exception. The fundamental question is, are we allowing that only the machine learning only for research or for all purposes, and under which conditions? But from a policy perspective, the real question I have for you is, but what happens in those countries that have not regulated TDM? Of course, there are courts that may decide, but in practice, what happened? Do you think they are not using data sets made by copyrighted works? It simply is not being discovered because in practice, enforcement and monitoring is extremely complicated, to use an euphemism, unless there is what was already mentioned by Tom, transparency. But transparency about the data set is not something that stems from, I mean, just it needs to be regulated, and for now is just one of the proposition. But of course, the main challenges are like, how do you monitor the enforcement and call for transparency? And the fact that it's not being regulated around the world doesn't mean that it's not happening. How the international treaties don't answer the question, but they provide enough flexibility to allow each system to strike the balance, and basically they enshrine a fundamental principle. It's called the Trista principle. So all the exception needs to be confined in special cases, should not have in conflict with the normal exploitation of the work, and not unreasonably prejudice the legitimate interest of the right holder. So you may already provide some answer to yourself whether a machine that is learning and potentially then competing with works created by a human, whether or not is creating a prejudice to a legitimate interest. Let's court decide and legislator decide. And then the other question is the output. How do we deal with the product of this AI model? Is there a policy interest in protecting those works generated by machines? I'm talking about autonomously generated by machines. Do they deserve protection? I think here we may say there is an agreement, and it's reflected, even if not openly in words, in the international framework, and I would say in the practically all legislation of the world. We need a human to trigger copyright protection. It's copyright law is central humans, philosophical, legal, reason, semantic. I can deep into it. The term of protection, moral rights, many things would not make sense without a human. And that has been further confirmed by the practice of administration, for instance, the US Copyright Office, and case law around the world. We need a human. But then, as already very well described by Mary, what do you mean you need a woman, a man, a human? Do you need a man to click a button? Do you need a man to just clean up a few lines of something that was generated by a machine? So the real question at the end are always on a ad hoc case-by-case basis. And now is the current approach is it's much cases are being solved, and copyright requires that we look at each instances where a human works with a machine or use AI to generate something, and we have to see whether the human undertakes a conduct that is considered to be sufficiently creative and define, and on what. This is what is happening nowadays, and it's what the system would allow. Of course, there are alternatives that were certainly conceived in a generative AI era that are the UK, for instance, works generated by computer, that is followed by many other common law countries' jurisdiction. The question of whether this could be applied or not could be a viable solution. But there are many other questions that remain unanswered, also in terms of the doctrine. So, for instance, there is a call for sui generis right, protecting. Is there a need for incentives for creating those works? And Mary, you're saying we should not protect AI-generated works. But the question I have for you is, okay, but have we done an impact assessment of what protecting or not protecting those outputs would mean? Because eventually you would have a lot of material that can be actually have a competitive advantage because it's cheaper, and even if it's not protected, you could still sell, for instance, a streaming subscription. You all read on the news the concerns about the universal music and Spotify. But at the end of the day, if people listen to that music, you can generate a market even if it's not protected. And the other big questions are, here we're talking, of course, about creativity and authorship. Fair enough, consider the forum, but international framework provides for related rights protection. For instance, phonogram producers. Phonogram producers, it's enough to find a person that invests in the first fixation of sound recording can be a legal person, or database protection. So there are other means that could help those people investing in the creation to find protection. For me, the big question is we are trying to find the solutions to interpret this blurry and constantly evolving situation through trying to interpret norms that were drafted, not taking into account the new environment. Perhaps at some point, a much more targeted and specific policy response would be needed, because in terms of remuneration, transparency, and so on, it's very hard to stretch what you have on paper nowadays. And whenever and wherever you look at this solution, one should take into account the international and cross-border dimension. Whenever there are all these machine learning projects, it's very hard to basically regulate or impose obligations if you go individually, one by one country or the other, because you may have servers or you have projects based abroad. So I think we see a lot of action and activity undertaken in the context of the input, how to regulate machine learning, a bit less about how to regulate output. Perhaps this would be left to the market, but for me, it's a very unique space, because we are hard to have a low-hanging or an easy solution to propose. It's not like there is a stakeholder is not making enough money, let's give him a remuneration right or something like that. In this case, it's much more complex, because the effect on the market, we don't know what they can be. And for instance, the example of streaming, for me, is a very fitting one. John.
Thank you, Paolo. The effect on the market is something that's a great concern to me, and I know to Mary as well. And I have a question sort of keyed up about that. But before I go there, I want to encourage the audience to throw their questions in the Q&A. We have a number, some have been answered already, and I will get to the ones that are there. But maybe we'll just start out with from where you left off, Paolo, about the market effect and concentrating on the output rather than the input. So my question to all of you, also I want to encourage all of you to ask each other questions. I'm not the boss of you. If you have something that you want to say, turn on your mic and interrupt me and ask a question. But the first question I have here is, and this gets into philosophical elements, but do you believe, as I do, that humans will naturally favor human creativity in the marketplace? And that paves the way for us making a premium economy out of identified and certified human creation. And then a side question is, how do we do that certification of humans? So I throw that out to all of you. And Mary, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
And I do want to, I hope we get back to some of the issues that Paulo raised around, ingest and output and the copyright issues, because I do think we're dealing with a copyright law that in essence, a framework that was created 300 years ago, where the primary exploitation of a copyrighted work was copying. It's called copyright law. And with AI, I don't think that's actually the case, but we'll talk about that later. We may have to rethink copyright law a little bit, because both on the ingest and the outputs, at least in the US, our framework doesn't work very well.
So you think we'll have to make copyright law even more complicated? Is that what you're saying, Mary?
Yeah, I think we may need, additional rights in terms of how AI uses copyright. But just to answer your question very quickly, yes, I do think that humans will prefer human created works, not all humans and not for all kinds of work. So the way I envision the future, the ideal future, is that there will be certain kinds of things that qualify as works, but that frankly, that are completely fact-based. It's just about information. But to your point, Tom, you certainly can't trust AI on the facts right now, but you can use it to write really fact-based material with a human. There's simple things that I think will naturally, I'm thinking, news reporting that's just about, facts, financial reporting, or we're already seeing this in kind of for business use, AI is being used. And so we will lose certain jobs, particularly at the entry level. Technical manuals, the kind of boring stuff that none of us really want to write anyway. Okay, there's a lot of uses for generative AI that I think are good. But when it comes to creativity, at least today, most people can tell the difference between what's AI generated and what's not, because it lacks that spirit. It lacks that connection to the world. So I think humans will prefer that. Again, at the sort of more commercial levels of the marketplace, their AI may replace human creativity. But to the point I was making earlier is that we want to prevent, the marketplaces from feeling like they have to use AI. And that will happen. I mean, I've already heard from CEOs of companies where they're concerned that competition, their investors are going to start, it will force them to use AI for certain types of things, for translation, for narration, for, certain kinds of writing. And why? Because, companies compete against one another and they've got to keep their costs down. So we want to create an infrastructure, if you may, that won't, through regulation and law, that won't force companies to, compete on that level. And because if you talk to, people go into publishing because they love books, they love human writing, right? They don't want to be forced to use AI. Translation, literary translators are writers. They write literature. And if an AI can't do that, so you don't want publishers feeling like they have to rely on AI translation just to stay competitive. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Mary. Tom, I see your hand up. I have the feeling you're going to tell me that I asked the wrong question. But
No,
I'm
I'm not that kind of philosopher. No, I mean, I'm going to do some agreeing. I think it's very instructive to look at what people are already doing. And just as Mary said, there are many areas in which people care very deeply about feeling they have a relationship with an author or creator. You know, that's what social media, TikTok, people go to events, people are deeply interested in following authors and artists, and it matters to them a great deal that they should not be deceived in that relationship, and that when they go to see ABBA Voyage in London, they know they're seeing avatars licensed by the originals. So I think we have a kind of twin danger here, which is quite interesting. And one is like the kind of the fact that ABBA can go on performing around the world long after they're deceased in an officially licensed version, which is that, as we've seen online already, a small number of very influential people can give the people what they want. And digital Tom Hanks and youthified Robert De Niro and you know, quite possibly digital versions officially licensed by authors that people love can go on churning out their works or work of the sort that people like. And the flip side of that, which again speaks to Mary's point, is that there are then many areas when people do not have a relationship with creators who are nevertheless significant. Translation is one such area, technical manuals, textbooks and things perhaps. Also, I'm very aware of work in sectors like video games, which is a sector I know very well. We take a big game, a AAA title as it's called, and it might have tens of thousands of hours of audio performed by actors and written by humans. It might have digital assets, as we call them, designed by huge numbers of artists and creators and so on. Costs are prohibitive and huge, and it's highly competitive. So we are already seeing enormous amounts of automation in these domains. You know, you can potentially reduce your costs. The budget might be hundreds of millions. The potential profits of a really big game are potentially in the billions. This is huge money. And these are, as it were, unseen human creators. And already, if you trawl the Reddit forums, you will see people who are create assets of video games and who love being involved in this industry saying that their workflow has been taken over by the obligation to use AI to become 20 times more productive. Good for a company. So we're forced to ask pretty rapidly which kinds of human creativity we wish to acknowledge and protect in certain ways, which bits we may believe will inevitably go by the wayside or will or won't. And I think a lot of this comes back to my point about inevitabilism, in that it just seems important to me that one really and truly believes that these conversations can be had, that one can talk to tech companies and governments and others. As Paolo outlined, it is extremely difficult to regulate in an opaque, internationalized, winner-takes-all, data-led arena. Nevertheless, conversations can be had in fora like this, where people come together and talk about what they want from systems. And in general, I do believe, actually, that a lot of the so-called demand for AI-generated marvelousness is fictional, is science fiction rather than fact, that people are on some level deeply interested in there being human skills that are respected. It's very interesting to think about areas when we don't care about that, but it's more often that we don't notice but turn out to care quite a bit. ABBA Voyage still has session musicians. They've rather worked out that you can't have an entirely recorded show masquerading as a live show, that you have to have the avatars with the live band. So I think it's important to be bold in these conversations and values-led, and not to be cowed by the notional complexities and immensities of tech.
That's fascinating. I had no idea that there was a live band as part of that show. That's a really interesting little detail about what we prefer. Paolo, do you have thoughts on this philosophical question?
You're much better placed than myself to decide whether human creation would continue to be more favorable, gain on the market towards AI. I think it's probably true. However, as already highlighted by Mary and Tom, there is a price to pay, a very important price to pay for the areas where AI-generated material is already gaining traction. And otherwise, you would ask why creators are going on strike, or you are organizing these kind of events. If it was as simple as human creation would always be better, then we wouldn't have, and humans will choose to consume humans' creation, then we wouldn't have a problem. I think there are many examples where AI-generated work are have a market, including in fine arts, picture, like for instance, the Obvious Art group in Paris. They pride themselves of creating, of selling, and devoting their lives selling basically works created by AI, by machines, and it was auctioned at Christie's for over $400,000 US. News reporting, information publishing. Even if it's not protected, you can still buy a news report and a subscription to Reuters. Who cares if it's protected or not? If they sell it and you pay it, in the music case, it's even more telling. Why would you, okay, let's assume AI-generated music is not protected. I don't think that's the fake streams is a different issue. If you have an AI machine that generates fake streams without having a human being actually listening, it's another issue. But if people want to listen music created by machine, and you are able to charge a price or sell advertisement on top of it, is already happening. So I think the solution, it needs to be a bit more nuanced than just is protected or not protected. It's frankly, it's really right. It's fascinating on the one hand, but on the other hand, it's extremely complex. Because the market issue is just started we're just starting to see the effect. I think we're just going, without mentioning, we don't have here actors, for instance, or dubbers. Certain professions would potentially disappear unless there is a heavy policy response from our governments.
Yeah, I agree. Can I, John, jump in?
Absolutely, yep.
So I just, a couple of things. One, I think right now we're seeing, there's novelty. And so people are using AI because it's novel, and they're using it in a way that is actually, inefficient, right? It's like there's a case in the US that the US Copyright Office was looking at of an illustrator using AI to create the illustrations for a graphic novel. And she said it took her a year to generate those images. I think an artist doing freehand, it would have been a lot quicker, although I'm not going to judge that. But I want to go back to your question, John, about do we want to have an identifier for what's AI generated? And I think we do. We actually, we surveyed authors in the US on AI, and then of those we found that like 24% are already using AI. Very, very few are using it to generate text. I think out of the 1,700 responses we got, only 7 people were using it to generate more than 25% of the text of a final product. Most people said if they were using it to generate text, they were completely editing it and revising it. And why? Because what does an author bring? They bring their voice, right? And they say one thing, the AI generated text, it doesn't have the voice. It doesn't necessarily say what you want it to say. So one woman we spoke to, like a lot of book authors, people make money from various different writing related ways. And she was writing for businesses, copy for businesses and websites. And she said that on a freelance basis, she's already lost, by the way, 70% of her work. And she said one company said, well, instead of instead of us paying you to write 10 pieces a month, we want you to start with AI and just edit it and do 30 pieces a month. And she said she just laughed at it because she says it's more work to start with something AI generated, actually. So I think that's, an interesting example. But so in these conversations with authors, one thing that they asked us, because we also had an open forum where we invited all our members to just talk to us about it. They said, can you create some guidelines? So if we're using AI, we want to be able to say, we're using ethical AI. We're using it ethically. So is there some way to indicate that? So we are going to try to come up with some guidelines with a lot of input from members and other authors and other author organizations for guidelines for ethical use. But we also want to come up with guidelines for anybody who's publishing, to be transparent about the use of AI. And that is, some kind of indicator that if something's generated by AI or what aspects of it are generated by AI, because the consumer deserves to note that. And we've spoken to Amazon about this too, and asking them to impose a requirement on people posting books that if a book is generated by AI to disclose that. And that's something like they can understand because they're very much about, the consumer, and consumers don't want to be deceived. If they want to buy something AI generated, to your point, Tom, you want to go see the Avatar ABBA, great. But you want to know what it is you're experiencing, if it's AI generated or not. And by and large for books, if it's AI generated, at least today, that the quality is going to be much worse. And we are already seeing a slew of AI generated books in Kindle. And they are, they're kind of copies about to be released, on the same subjects, but they're much, much worse.
I kind of think of it as like the labels you get on food for genetically modified. There's disagreement. Some people absolutely don't want genetically modified food or don't fully understand it, and others don't care, but everyone is okay with knowing about it, knowing what's there and what's not. Tom, do you have any thoughts on ethical AI? That's a new term for me, but I like it.
I mean, someone has very kindly shared some of the UNESCO points about ethical AI in the Q&A box, and it's interesting that there's quite a lot of convergence around principles such as responsibility, accountability, transparency, and explainability, as well as various forms of proportionality and non-maleficence, not doing harm. And the interesting thing for me is that these principles are to be applauded. I think they're very important, but the devil is in the detail, as Paolo was saying. Many people would agree that they want to know what's going on. I think, unfortunately, as an author, I would love to believe that in the long term, it's safe for me to say you'll always have to tell me apart from an AI trained on my stuff. I'm just not sure that is true. I think it's a dangerous battle to kind of stake one's territory upon, that we will always be able to tell the difference. To some degree, we need to care about the human involvement in differentiation and transparency, even if, or perhaps because, in many circumstances, we will not be able to tell the difference. The challenge is precisely the degree to which we are vulnerable to deception, to which the story we're told by a system can fool us. AIs are very good indeed at pattern recognition. And so for me, a lot of the ethics comes back to really the agreements that bound what particular companies do and how they get to do business. There are the principles we should aspire towards, which I think is very important, and UNESCO have done a lot of great work, among others, in clarifying. But a lot of it comes down to some very nitty and very gritty stuff about really, well, how is it that I can trust these people? And we in a way, we have to be cynics. I think Paolo was perhaps making a version of this point. We cannot rely upon our kind of intuition or our sensitivity online. And partly it's about how we involve then the offline world, if you sort of mean, how we harness the fact that, the world is where people are. Trust is deserved and earned and given, or in the real world of citizenship and embodiment and life. And it may well be that actually, in terms of what allows us to trust, we're going to have to kind of fall back on some off-screen things, that there's going to have to be approaches that are kind of messy rather than conducted in the realm of software and law, that are going to involve people in particular places. That sounds very vague, but I worry a great deal about well-meaning people betting the farm on the fact that they will always be able to tell the difference between the outputs of humans and AIs in the online arena. Unfortunately, I think that is not going to remain true in all cases for all time, and we need to be very prepared for it to get messy and for us to have to seek recourse elsewhere.
I just want to say I completely agree with you on that.
Yeah.
I mean, with GPT-5, it's going to be a whole nother level, for instance, of ability to mimic humans.
And that answers one of the questions in the Q&A, which is, do you really think we'll be able to tell the difference?
Can I put on a little writer's hat quickly to speak up for this? So, I mean, I think the author Ed Yong wrote a much cited essay in the New Yorker in the last few months when he made a really important point, which I think applies to education as well, which is that, very broadly speaking, the act of writing or trying to find words, trying to work out as a human being what you mean and what you think, is intrinsically valuable and is bound up with good thinking and citizenship and engagement and knowledge and understanding. So the idea that you just can and should prompt an AI and it will produce something fluent and there you are, that's every bit as good as finding words, I think that is plain wrong and misconceived and dangerous. I'm not saying that all writing has to be thoughtful and marvelous and that everything has to be done by unaided humans and you're a bad person if you look stuff up on Google. But I think it's very important to be clear, especially when it comes to children and education in the future, that we think through words, we think with words, and the act of trying to find words and thinking and rethinking what words mean and what is true and isn't true is enormously important. And it is very dangerous civilizationally as well as culturally to undermine, hollow out, or undervalue this.
Well, you have just queued up a great question that we have in the Q&A, so thank you for doing that. This is from Maria Fernanda Mendoza in Mexico. Hello, Fernanda, colleague. She says, right now in some universities, they're starting to discuss if they have to change the rules for the thesis that the students have to do for their degree, and to not accept the ones that use AI. What do you think about that? I know what I think about it as a father who is currently paying for kids to go to university. I think I fall with Tom on that I want a premium placed on originality in the education sector. This is a little bit of left field from the creativity that we're talking about, but anybody have thoughts on this? Mary?
Yeah, so I mean, I totally agree with what Tom just said, that learning to write is about learning to think. And that's what makes writing hard. It's the thinking and organizing the thoughts. It's also why we need a professional class of writers, because, working with writers, it's just, they spend their lives perfecting their craft and learning to express emotions and ideas with words, and they have the ability to do so in a way that the rest of us don't. But for education, we absolutely need to continue to teach children to write, and university students to be writing and thinking, and not just to rely on AI. Now, I have a son who's doing a master's at Oxford, and he told me that, and I kept telling him, he's having a hard time kind of at one point organizing his thoughts. And I was just like, go to GPT and it'll help you. He goes, I'm not going to do that. Well, it turns out, he said, he thinks he's the only one in his program who didn't use AI in their recent exams. So it's clearly, everywhere. I hope that we teach this next generation how to use AI as a tool, because I think everybody's going to have to understand how to use AI as a tool in writing and in many other respects. And, in research to to flourish in the careers in the future. And it can be helpful. It can make everyone a better writer if you use it as a tool and you leave the thinking and the actual writing to the human. So there are going to have to be rules around it. How you enforce it is probably the same way you enforce, plagiarism rules. There are technologies for it. But yeah, I mean, the educational system is going to have to figure this out.
Thoughts from anybody else on the education side, Tom?
Yeah, I can, I suppose, leap in. It's very interesting. I think in general that Mary's making a very important point, which is that learning how to use these systems rather than be used by them, how to be a critically engaged user of automated systems is an incredibly important skill. I also think that in general, models of education that, if you like, are kind of surveillance and paranoia based are not good for learners. So the idea that people will be, so to speak, invigilated by systems that will portray them all as kind of potential cheats who are trying to palm off stuff, not as their own work and so on, damages much that's at the heart of the educational relationship, that people should be encouraged to be open about the ways in which they use AI to support their learning, reflective upon what it means to use AI well, and crucially reflective upon the limitations, not just of systems, but data sets. As we all, I think, ought to know, AI data training sets can naturally encode many biases from the human world, wrapped up in our language, wrapped up in our history, wrapped up in our culture. And crucially, all of the doubt, all of the questioning comes from people. In fact, it's not much talked about, but very important, that AI companies employ a lot of often very badly paid people to try and make their systems safer and less biased and less offensive by trawling through some of the terrible outputs they might otherwise produce upon the basis of past human data or scrapes or whatever. So, the prospect of a kind of critically engaged, intelligent, discerning dialogue with machine systems is enormously important. I think the idea that there are kind of, you can fight AI with AI and have sort of perfect cheating and plagiarism detection engines is a little bit wishful, that this is sort of prefiguring a kind of arms race that doesn't do good things for education. I write critical thinking textbooks. I design online courses. I spend a lot of time teaching at speaking at universities and schools. Interestingly, a lot of sessions that I do, partly because it's my privilege as someone who comes in and doesn't have to deliver an entire course, take the form of highly interactive seminars and debates. When I want people to think about AI, I get them to close their computers and debate conceptual ideas with each other in small groups and pairs to talk about what it means to ask of these systems questions worth answering. I feel that that gives the most value to people. And I'm deeply interested in general in how we can learn from students the skills they think they need, how we can work with them to help them become more critically discerning users of machine systems, and how we can empower them to reflect upon these practices and equip them for a world in which, yes, natural language will be the default way we interact with digital systems, but we need to be incredibly cognizant of the biases and inequities and problems and limitations and lack of self-doubt that these systems inherently and will always have.
Yeah, it's like when my kids were school age, they the internet, was just becoming a place of research, and the schools did quickly start educating children in what you can rely on online and what you can't. And this is just a much more complex version of that. In fact, we're all going to have to, be educated in what you can trust online and what you can't trust online going forward. And I personally am worried you're not going to be able to trust anything online because there'll be so many deep fakes. But I think it's a challenge for the educational system, but one that they can address. And I love your idea about just, dialogue. or any, maybe we'll go back to oral exams. I had to do orals for my master's.
And your master's was in philosophy, I believe. was
Yeah.
it? Yes, there you go. Paolo, do you have thoughts on this?
Really, I leave it to the philosophers and educator. It's not my job. I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's good. It's good. Tom, I'm very interested in this idea you have of forcing the students to be human in a sense, and that it reminds me of copyright conversations from 10 years ago when we would talk about sort of the analog whole. That you can, if you remove yourself from the digital world, copyright becomes much easier. If you're talking about, oh, you can't see that, nobody can see that. Oh, that was a notebook that I use an actual pen to write in. So, but you're reasonably confident that when you start one of these debates, that everyone in the debate is a human and not a robot?
Reasonably confident so far, although that may change with time.
Good. We have a great question. How's our time? Oh, we're doing fine. We have a great question from Dr. Maggie G, I believe in the UK. She asked, she'd be very interested to hear Paolo expand on his analogy to streaming services like Spotify. Can we actually trust publishers to stay true to their love of writers, editors, translators? I guess a lot of the industry trends have been towards just maximizing the market, and so a lot of writers, editors, translators have exited the industry already. So can we trust this?
Certainly can't answer that question. The second part about whether you can or cannot trust your publisher, but I'm sure Mary and Tom may have their own views. Perhaps the point I was making about the streaming, the fake streaming scandal or news, it's something, frankly, it's we still have to see exactly what it means, but there are two aspects, and I think we have to. So the point I was making is that protecting or not protecting specific creative content is not a determining factor of its viability or marketability or market value. Classic examples, like classic music, Shakespeare, the Bibles still sell, okay? No doubt. You can have news reports made on a machine. If you're able to sell it, it's okay. Similarly, if you have AI-generated music and people listen to it on a streaming service, look, people can reproduce it. It's not protected by copyright, but it doesn't impede you to commercialize it. Another issue, completely different, is whether in the case you have a machine that creates fake streams to generate inexistent market share for your non-original music. That's another issue, and it's not new. It already existed in the TV era and broadcasting. I mean, I won't go into the details, but there are cases of broadcasters at the same time are publishers that at night they broadcast their own production. It's I don't think it's nothing new on the side, but there are two separate issues.
Yeah,
the protection issue is important, but I don't see it as the determining factor of the market, the potential market influence of those content. That's we still have to see it, huh? But that's my.
Yeah, I'd like to respond to that because I mean, I've heard those arguments, and one, I think giving any protection to AI generated work and being concerned, well, they're public domain, so they, they're going to necessarily be free, which you weren't saying, but I've heard that argument. So we need to worry, they'll flood the market because they're free. I think we're really turning copyright on its head if we don't acknowledge that the copyright incentives are meaningful, and that by not giving copyright, you are taking away that incentive. It's hard to envision businesses investing a lot of money in creating AI works that can be copied. And that's what we worry about, not like the kids who create, a fake Drake song and post it on Spotify. There are also technological ways of preventing those kind of fake streams. So we've worked with Amazon for years on sort of issues on their site, and at one point they were having a problem in Kindle Unlimited where you were getting paid by the number of reads because people were using server farms to fake read, right? And they were able to address that technologically. Spotify is going to be able to do the same. And I think if we also have rules around AI generated content having to be marked as such, that will help too. Will there, will it be a perfect system? No, but it's going to be less perfect if you provide incentives for people to use AI to generate content through the copyright system.
May I, just to clarify, I agree. I was not suggesting there is a need to protect. I think probably I don't think
was addressing just arguments I've heard from.
I think probably the real answer should be looked towards the transparency. We should be able to know whose music scores is being used to generate that AI generated music, and recognize that in some fashion, either through, requesting permission or payment or transparent. I think flagging it as AI generated is one option. I don't know whether it would be a copyright solution, but I heard on the news that are already influencers that are asked to flag whenever they're using filters. But I think it's a very important point that we have to address. I think the transparency is a much more immediate potential tool.
Tom, did you have thoughts on this side?
I think Paolo and Mary have spoken to it very eloquently. I'm not sure I have a great deal to add on this one.
Good. We are not. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Mary.
I want to make sure that we go back to some of the copyright issues. I don't know if there are any questions around that, because I think Paula just sort of, touched on a couple, whether things are copyright or not copyright. And one really crucial question that we haven't gotten to yet is how are creators and those that who invest in them going to be compensated in this new world? So, as we talked about at the beginning, AI exists only because of the works it was trained on, right?
Yep.
So shouldn't those creators be compensated for that? When AI is is being used to create new works that potentially compete with their works. So that's one issue. The other issue that we haven't talked much about is on the output side. What about sound-alikes, look-alikes, in the style of, we now have things being sold online that are, like chat boxes based on well-known brand name authors. You can sort of go in and explore, all of their works by putting in certain prompts. Those kind of outputs that are very much based on the work of one or more particular artists, or their brand or their identity, or where someone's voice is being used. We have to find a way to compensate that. And so I would love to ask, Tom and Paulo and you, John, how are we going to compensate creators for these kind of uses? We're looking at different collective licensing solutions in the US, and we have much less history, certainly in the text field, with collective licensing than you guys do. But I just, personally, speaking for myself, feel like we've got to find a way to bring some income back to the creators.
Yeah, there's a great question in the Q&A from Nana Lund about this, focusing on the input side anyway. And I'm tempted when you ask that question to say, well, it's sort of too late on the input side, but that's not true, is it? I mean, the training goes on, and as AI intends to get better, more and more material needs to be used. But I will throw it to the other two, Paolo or Tom. Do you have thoughts on what Mary's asked?
I can go first, but I don't know how usefully I'll go first. I mean, I guess for me, this partly dovetails with the point I made earlier about fake persons. And my understanding, Paolo will correct me on this, is that these are fairly kind of sound-alikes and so on, are fairly kind of novel areas or novel challenges for law. But it strikes me that it's the kind of thing that would potentially fall under a wider approach to the issue of kind of fake and real people, the difference between them, and whether and in what ways someone, you know, kind of it is acceptable to sound like someone or like a particular kind of person and so on. It does strike me that we're going to need quite robust responses by governments to fake people, to the imitation of people, because it poses challenges across so many different domains. Interestingly, we have, of course, already seen among well-known people a spectrum of things going on here. So I believe that the artist Grimes has said to people, go on and use my voice or you know, kind of remix away, whereas other artists such as Drake and so on have publishers have said, you know, you're getting a bit close to the bone with the stuff you're imitating here. Please don't do that. Please take this down. And of course, in the movie industry, there's really very long-standing, I think, you know, image-related contractual and other arrangements around people's likenesses, around the reuse of people's likenesses, around how it can appear, and so on. Again, I find myself remembering the world of video games, which is an arena where for a long time now in sports games, for example, you know, very complicated licensing deals have been set up so that the faces of real people can appear in football games, you know, so that in Championship Manager or FIFA or whatever, you know, they've got the permission to use football, soccer for our American friends, likenesses around the world. There's stuff that's already there in that sense. You know, there's already deals that have been done about creating kind of digital versions or pseudo versions of people. So I will be super interested, I think, to watch how this evolves. But my sense is that this is part of a much larger problem about faking and imitating and ripping off real people. And interestingly, the last thing I'd say is we often find with technology and I guess law and precedent, which is not my field, that there are certain things that make a hypothetical suddenly feel very urgently real to people. And when they and governments and others sit up and take notice because a sort of hypothetical possibility, oh, this could happen, this might happen, suddenly tips over towards real harm. So with social media, you know, you move from kind of hypothetical harms to potentially electoral manipulation or the emergence of real world violence or discrimination or injustice. And similarly, perhaps with AI, you know, we have potential inflection points where hypothetical things that people play around with and do wonderful entertaining stuff with, images and voices and prank calls or whatever, suddenly potentially tip over into real world harms. And that tends to be real world economic damage from people with perhaps deep pockets. And this is then the world at which legislatures and others maybe could sit up and take notice, and things start to be put together when that kind of point where reality bites and the hypothetical becomes painful.
Thanks, Paolo.
I don't know how you're gonna get remunerated those authors. There are a number of proposals, of course. For instance, the TDM exception in Europe looks at licensing. No, I mean that's rights holder can opt out and therefore should provide some licensing. I believe I was actually hoping to hear from you some specific example of licensing happening on publishing content, because that would be, in my view, the publisher should have this option, and probably is already happening. And afterwards, then distributed. And that it's a case where it could work. In other industries, remuneration can go through, of course, licensing, but transparency is essential. Otherwise, you don't know who to distribute the money, even if you get them. I mean, that's a pretty important practical question, unless you use some sort of proxy. And then there has been, of course, flagged is not at all a concrete proposal, but to have a sort of compensation for an exception, a bit like how it works for private coffin levies. But we don't have many. The only concrete solution in place is the directive that opens up for licensing. Perhaps you have example. Perhaps on one note, a very WIPO note, it was very surprising for me reading the article that was reporting about the expert hearing, at the beginning of this week at the UK Parliament. According to the report on IPCATS, one of the recommendations of the witnesses was actually for UK to join and ratify the Beijing Treaty on Audiovisual Performances, which is a treaty that protects basically performers whenever recorded on camera, and include control of what happens with their performance, including moral rights, being recognized as the performer, but also to integrity, to object to modification of that performance that would be detrimental to the honor to the. So, according to the witnesses, this would be a way to potentially oppose to performance synthesization or deepfakes, but it's a completely unexplored area. I just found it extremely interesting because it's the first time we hear this argument, and it's an international treaty that we administer, and we never talked about the spin-off effect or the potential additional tool that would give to actors and audiovisual performers.
Yeah, so if I could just jump in and say, we are looking at creating a collective license, both on the ingest, because we see it as an ongoing use. It's not a one-time use. It's not a done deal. But also on the output. And I just want to note, our Congress had several hearings on AI last week, but to touch on copyright. And one, Sam Altman, who's the CEO of OpenAI, testified at, and he actually said that he believes that for these outputs where creators' works are clearly being used, the lookalikes, soundalikes, or others, that creators should be compensated. And we've also been talking to people who tell us that although the technology is not there now to figure out how to compensate creators for this, to detect what works are being used and what outputs, it is entirely conceivable, and some people are working on developing it. So I do hope we get to a point where there is, on either an opt-in or opt-out basis, a license for that, that would bring money back to the creators, because we don't want to just say no to these kinds of uses. It might be a new source of revenue for creators.
Great. Yep, Tom?
Just very quickly, for the sake of completeness, I should note that Grimes said, feel free to use my voice without penalty as long as I get 50% of the royalties.
That's right. I know. So, I was going to bring that up.
Indeed. So she very cannily preempted. Maybe she's offered a business model, and of course, it's her because it was her official online accounts and so on.
But it shows how far behind we are, because copyright doesn't really work that way. Once you've released that right, the negotiation is theoretical at best, right? So, but we have reached the end of our time. I want to thank this amazing panel, Mary, Paolo, Tom. What a discussion. The recording of this will be made available by the International Authors Forum at a later date. And of course, the IAF will continue to monitor developments around AI and regulation. I think for me, the one remaining discomfort in all of this, because you have made me more confident about it through this discussion, is how will regulators ever catch up to what already has happened? When I think about how slowly things have moved around copyright around the world, and especially here in Canada, where I live and work, I'm a little afraid that the AI train left the station far too long ago for them to catch up. But Mary, it sounds like your hearings went well enough that you have a bit more confidence on that.
Yeah, but I do just want to end by saying that I think these solutions are going to have to be international. And I think Paulo and Tom said that earlier, because these businesses are international. And that to me, it's like hard enough to get our own governments to respond and act. But WIPO, I think WIPO is going to have to play a role in helping to very quickly.
It's all you, Paulo. You got to fix this whole thing.
Yep.
There is a question, I mean, many questions on the audience for that. I think lawmaking at the international level is extremely slow and complex, but there is nothing specifically focusing on TDM on the table, but we are hearing more and more, at least through the lenses of research and specific proposals, but there is no, I mean, there is no proposal for AI treaty, AI and copyright treaty for now.
Yet, right. Okay, so we'll leave it there. Thank you to all of the people who joined us in the audience. I saw a pretty big number there on my screen, so that's great. Everyone who asked questions, I'm sorry if I didn't get to your question. And again, thank you to the panel and to the International Authors Forum for hosting this. Bye-bye, everybody.